everyone, and welcome to our new podcast, where we will feature audiobook excerpts and interviews with a variety of authors. My name is Kathy Logan, and I'll be interviewing author Catherine Kullmann, who has so far written 7 Regency romances, all of which have high reviews on Amazon and Kindle Unlimited. Without further ado, let's get started. When did you start writing stories?
Now, I started writing stories 10 years ago, but in fact, I've always loved writing from when I was at school, from when I was at primary school. I loved writing essays. And through my professional career, I was a civil servant, and I worked for the New Zealand Embassy in Bonn, and I worked for a large firm of solicitors here in Dublin. All of these required very careful drafting and redrafting. So I suppose you could say I have been writing all my life, so that when it came to starting to write fiction, I had a very, very, very solid foundation to stand on. And I started writing then, I don't have the exact date, about 10 years ago. I had a bout with breast cancer. And when I was finished over a year's treatment, I decided I would take early retirement. Now, it takes a little while for the brain fog to clear, after chemo and all the rest of it. But when I got to that stage, I had always wanted to write fiction, and I was literally, if not now, when. So that was when I started.
Oh, that's awesome. And then, so you said that you like writing fiction. Like, when did you realize you specifically wanted to write like Regency era fiction?
It was Regency from the very beginning. I suppose I was first introduced to the Regency when I was at school, and it would have been through literature. So it would have been Jane Austen, of course, and then the Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Byron, Keats, Shelley, are all from the Regency. And there were wonderful essayists as well, like Charles Lamb. And then the Georgian essayists who went before them, like Hazlitt, for example. So we did all of that at school, and I just loved the style and the writing. In those days in Ireland, you didn't have a small group of set texts each year for the exams. But what they did was they put out big anthologies of prose and poetry that were valid for many years. It was very useful if you had a family with a lot of children, because you could pass these books on down. And then each year the curriculum would make a selection of the prose and a selection of the poetry. So you had like a book maybe this size, a big book, 3 or 4 inches, but you didn't have to do it all. You would do, now I'm really totally off the top of my head here, but shall we say that you did maybe 12 poems and you did 6 prose extracts? That would be the curriculum. And then on top of that, we would have had a play by Shakespeare. And as well, all of that, on top of all of that, we would have been writing essays. So we at my school, we had a written assignment as homework every week in each language. I had 4 languages. I had English, Irish, Gaelic, French, and German. So one week you would write a free essay on a subject, whatever the teacher assigned. It could be philosophical, it could be pure imaginative. And then the other week, the assignment would be directly related to one of the texts. So, as I say, I had a lot of practice in writing from very early on. And these were corrected as well. The teachers would correct them. So you would, apart from, obvious errors in terms of grammar, maybe, but though he had got a very, very good foundation in grammar in the preceding years, I'm talking about the last 2 years now of my school, of secondary school, but they would also, commend you if you phrase something nicely, or maybe pick out a phrase that could have been expressed more felicitously. So you were learning really from the beginning. So that was my first introduction, really, would have been through the literature. Then Regency, the next thing then would, of course, been Georgia Hare, who was still alive and writing. I'm talking about the 60s. And she was still alive and writing then, and you got a new book every year, which was wonderful. Plus the whole backlist. I think every reader will agree there is nothing better than discovering a new author with a huge backlist, because it's just wonderful to be able to settle in there. So that would have been the next thing. And Georgia Hare, I think every writer of Regency has to tip the hat to her, because she really created the Regency genre. And on top of that, she set a benchmark for research. I am in awe of what she achieved without the internet. She lived in London, and she used to go to the London Library, and she would borrow 10 books at a time. And
wow.
Do her research. But then if she had found something of interest, there are wonderful illustrations. That was one of the things that surprised me when I started my research into the Regency period, was the huge amount and variety of coloured illustrations, of hand-coloured illustrations that you had, from fashion prints to illustrations of books to cartoons and satirical caricatures. But if Georgette, I've seen a copy of one of her notebooks. She kept very detailed research notebooks. But if she found a fashion plate with, say, 10 different bonnets, she actually drew and colored them into her notebooks herself. Because, she started writing, I think, in the 20s and the 30s. So we're not talking about, nowadays it's so easy for us to snap a photograph and we have it on our phone, or to make a photocopy, or to scan something on your printer. She would have had none of that. I mean, photography was there, of course, but it would have been your Kodak, and then you would have to take your negatives, your film, to be printed, and it would have been very expensive, and there would have been delays. So this was the way Georgia Hare did it. So they would have been what made me really first look at the Regency. And then it is such a fascinating period. I think of it as the foundation of our modern world. In 1800, we had the Act of Union that abolished the Irish Parliament and created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Now, as you know, we're still living with the results of that today here in Ireland, very much so. Then we had the Napoleonic Wars, which ran from 1803 to 1815. And really, the Battle of Waterloo could have gone either way. So we have to ask ourselves, supposing Napoleon had won, had changed the history of Europe and indeed of the world. And the final very, very interesting thing is the Anglo-American War of 1812. America won, and essentially England, or the Great Britain, had to withdraw completely from the idea of gaining the American colonies that they had lost, of regaining them, if that had gone differently. So these three events all really are so important, and they were happening at the time. And at the time, people were dealing with the results of them and with the consequences. A very obvious consequence that at the time before the Act of Union, Ireland had its own parliament in Dublin, and the Irish MPs and the Lords, the peers, they met in Dublin. So there was a very vibrant Dublin season as well, and political life in Dublin. Well, with the Act of Union, all that was shifted to London, to the Westminster. So first, of course, it had an effect on society in Ireland. It made worse the problem of absentee landlords. the people owning the big estates, but not spending much time in Ireland or on their estates, and leaving middlemen like stewards and land agents to run the estates. And for a lot of these landlords, they were only interested in the profit that they could get and the rents they could extract from the tenants. Then another small thing, they had to cross by boat to Holyhead, and the Isle of Anglesey, where Holyhead is on, was still island at that stage. So having taken the boat from Ireland to Holyhead, they would cross then the Isle of Anglesey, and then they would have to cross the Menai Straits in another boat, right? And bad weather, and you can imagine what the roads were like. So one of the things that happened in the first 20 years was the building of a wonderful bridge over the Menai Straits, which completely shortened the length of time it took to travel between Dublin and London. A small consequence, but important for the people at the time. So these are the things that we just look at, and I just found all of this fascinating. Then you have as well, I mean, I've spoken about the literature. It's also, you've had the beginning of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. You're into Romanticism now. You have people, appealing for the rights of man. You have the after effects of the French Revolution, which frightened the upper classes in England, but gave the lower classes a few ideas. You had Mary Wollstonecraft writing a vindication of the rights of women. You had women raising their voices against the patriarchy. And you also had a situation that there was, in Great Britain and Ireland, because of the barricade between the continent during the Continental Wars, like internal tourism in England developed hugely, and in Ireland as well. So people would go to the Lake District, and they would go to the lakes of Killarney because they couldn't go to the Alps. Now, of course, in 1815, it started in 1814, when Napoleon was defeated and suddenly the continent was thrown open again. Then they all started travelling abroad again. But the other side of that was that French goods were able to be imported into England again, which they hadn't been before. That had a knock-on effect on a lot of the industries, and in particular the industries around fashion. So the manufacture of fabric, weaving, of ribbons, which were hugely important in the Regency. You'd know zips. You either had buttons or something that you could tie. It could be what they called laces, like a shoelace, but not brown, but lovely and white, and you could lace up your corset with them, or you would tie your stockings on with a ribbon as a garter. That was the original garter, was just a piece of ribbon that you tied either under the knee or over the knee, below the top of the stocking. So because you didn't have, well, what here in Ireland we call suspenders, I think they call them garters in the US, right? But the original garter was just a piece of ribbon. So there was a huge industry for ribbons, especially around Nottingham. And with the influx then of ribbons from France, because I mean, after all, French style was always regarded, if you like, as having that little bit more, the ooh la la, and people were delighted to have something different. So that in a lot of the industries, well, if they didn't quite collapse, there was certainly a big recession, which led to calls for political reform and protests, and that all gone on. When I talk about the Regency, I talk about roughly from 1797, when the later Prince Regent married, and his father had already had one episode of madness but had recovered from it. So there had been talk of a regency previously. Now the actual regency was 1810 to 1820. That was when the Prince of Wales became the Prince Regent, when George III was finally declared mad and a regent put in, and then he died in 1820. But the period of the influence of the regent really would be 1797 to 1830 when he died. So I kind of look at that whole period. I don't take an arbitrary, well, if you're writing Regency, it has to be 1810 to 1820. You can take the overall, what they call the extended Regency, is what I look at, because I think it gives you the larger picture. And then you can even, I mean, I haven't done it, but I know some authors have extended the reign of William IV from 1830 to 1837, because he was the Prince Regent's brother. So he would still have been, very much in that style and manner. He didn't change much. The huge change was 1837, when the young 17-year-old Queen Victoria came to the throne, and she reigned till 1901. So that was the rest of the 19th century was Victorian. And by that stage, you already had steamboats and your trains. So the Regency, again, it's the end of the age of the horse. Now, horse and carriages went parallel really until the beginning of the 20th century. But the fact that you could get on a train and, be somewhere maybe in 3 hours, that might have taken you, and I'm going now with the original slower train times, but still, it would have taken you a whole day to get there by horse and carriage, because you'd have had to change horses about every 10 miles, because you couldn't put your put your horses to the to your carriage and expect them to trot along all day. They just couldn't do it. I don't know if you remember. Have you read Mansfield Park by Jane Austen?
That is one I have not read,
No.
unfortunately, but I
Okay,
need
fine. Yeah.
to.
Anyway, there's a situation in that where Fanny, the heroine, in some disgrace, she's been living with her uncle and aunt for several years she grew up there as a teenager, really. She's turned down a very advantageous proposal of marriage, and she's been sent back in some disgrace to her parents, to live with her parents, who are not well off at all. Her mother and Lady Bertram are sisters. Lady Bertram made a really good marriage, and the sister married a Mr. Price, and who was, not a great match at all. So anyway, they sent her, the Bertrams, she's in trouble, but I don't mean that in trouble in the sense of being pregnant, but, they're angry with her. But they do send her in their own carriage. They don't make her take the public transport, which would have been the coach. But after two changes, the first two changes, and after that, then the horses are brought back to the Bertrams, and they go on with hired horses for the rest, because that would be the most that their horses could do really in the day without risking damage to them, and having her make the journey in one day. So the advance of steam had a huge effect, like on transport within Britain and, well, all over Europe, really. I'm not sure when the first trains came to the US. And also steamboats meant that people weren't dependent on sail, so that boat navigation and that would have been more reliable. You couldn't be literally caught in the doldrums, and waiting for a week for the winds to pick up again. You would have to stay the steam as well. I think initially they may well have had a sort of hybrid, because if you have the like today, when we think of it for another reason, wind is free. So if you can assist your steam with sail, you're using less coal and burning less energy. So that's a very long and involved thing as to why the Regency really interests me. And then finally, the fashion is, of course, beautiful. We can wear it today, and every so often the Empire line, as it's described as, comes up again. And in fact, in the 60s with the mini dresses, there were two styles. One was the Empire line for the small busted, and there was the Princess line, which is essentially shape is given not by a seam under the bust, but by two long seams that ran from the bust down to the hips, two long darts down the front of a dress, and they would kind of take in at the waist. They would, they would go out at the waist and then taper away again. So you got your nice fitted dress. I think it was called after Princess Alexandra, but I'm not sure. So anyway, a very long answer, I'm afraid, Kathy. You should cut me short when I'm waffling on like this.
No, I had fun listening to your answer. That was a very good answer. And like it helped me too to realize like how much, because I didn't really know how much history really occurred around the Regency era. Because I feel like before that I just assumed like, oh, it's 1810s to 1820. But knowing
Yeah.
now it's like it's a whole extended period. So thank you for telling me that because now I know a lot more about the Regency era. So yeah, so thank you so much for that great answer.
Good.
But I was wondering if we could, I wanted to ask you specifically about your stories themselves and the
Sure.
characters.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what is like the inspiration for your characters? Like what do you use to like create like your main characters? Like maybe like specifically Rosa and Julian from
Mhm.
your book I'm currently reading, A Suggestion of Scandal, which I love that title, by the way.
Oh, that's good. Now, it's usually with me something, there's a trigger. It might be a what if. I'm not sure how far you are on in the suggestion of scandal, and I don't want to go in for any spoilers, but I read about a real life scandal involving a governess. I won't say any more, but there will be something similar will happen in a suggestion of scandal. And I wondered what happened to her afterwards. You know, my youngest son, who is a wonderful beta reader, and it's very interesting because he never heard of Regency or read any Regency before he read my book. So he comes to them with a very cold eye, which is very good. But he commented once about my books that I like to know what happens after the first happy end. And I'll come back to that. But in with Rosa and Julian, certainly the first thing was, well, okay, this is the governess. She's caught up through no fault of her own in this scandal. What happened to her? So that was how I started. Um, then I, I, I'm more of a pantser than a plotter, or shall we say, my first draft is very extended plotting. But before I start, write chapter one, I do some work on the characters, on the main characters. I kind of think about them, who they are, what their situation is, what their backstory is. And with Rosa, it was a question, apart from anything else, of her plausibly meeting a hero, if you know what I mean. That because a governess situation was very difficult. She was neither fish nor flesh. She wasn't a servant because she was paid, but she was an employee. But she was a lady, so she would dine with her employers, and she would be at their entertainments. Now, a little bit, always kind of waiting for the nod to go and do something or to a little task, but she would be one of the guests, not one of the servants. So like a poor relation, and in fact, a lot of them would have been poor. Well, they were certainly somebody else's poor relation, and because that was why they would be out earning a living. But you could have had poor relations acting in roles like that within their own families as well. So I decided that probably the easiest or whatever would be, and I don't even know, I can't tell you, it just happens,
Yeah.
right? So
Mhm.
Rosa's charge, Chloe, when the book opens, is 16, and her father is going to be 60, and there's going to be a big house party. And Chloe is essentially going to come out. Well, sort of. She's not having a London season yet. She's too young for that. But she will be at the party and she won't be, still up in the schoolroom. So I thought, well, if Chloe had an elder brother, say a half brother from a first marriage, he
Mhm.
would be of an age then for Rosa, and he would have known Rosa, all the time. Rosa has been with Chloe for 10 years. So that was part of the backstory that I had, how she came to be there. And she's been with Chloe, and he's known her all the time, but she's just been like there in the background. So something has to happen for him to see her differently, right? And also because she knows him and knows him well, she is past the stage of being wary of him as she would have been in the beginning, and she would have been warned to have been very wary of sons in the family, and not only the sons but her employer, but any males in the family, that they would, if they showed an interest in her, it would not be a good interest. But she's known him 10 years as well, so that gave me them. And it comes to me then as I write. It's the only way I can say it. I know that there are some writers who do hugely elaborate sketching of characters and plotting and have very elaborate plans and everything. But I found, like, I tried that in the beginning, but I found that the spontaneity was going into the plotting and not into the writing. So that when I, opened my notebook and said, okay, like I should be doing this now, I found it didn't flow as well as when I was doing the first one. So I said, no, I'm just going to get myself started and see where it takes me. All my books are that they happen in the same time period, they happen within the same social set. So obviously, characters that appear in one will appear in another. Maybe somebody who has a small part in one will have a major part in another. And I have a couple of people who appear in all of them as minor characters. But as well as that, everybody intermarries, obviously, because that's just the whole point of the season. Make a good match for the girls. And I see we've 10 minutes left now.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
yeah, so I do very elaborate family trees for my characters, for my main characters, going back 3 and 4 generations.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and and I can feed in then, so that there will be intermarriages and people can discover that they are cousins and all this sort of thing. So that helps a lot. It gives me a very good structure. And if I'm looking for a character, I can go back to my family trees and I can say, oh, yes, I can take them. I don't have to start working on them from the very beginning. And when I do that, I go back to any other books that they have featured in and go through and read what I said about them so that I have continuity. So that would be, I suppose, one of my secrets. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for and yeah, telling me that. And it's interesting too because it's honestly it seems to be like a very different method for like authors, like on how they like develop their characters. Like you said, like it's more
Well, you see,
spontaneous. Yeah.
yes, I'm fortunate or unfortunate, I don't know, is that I am entirely self-taught. I haven't done any creative writing courses or anything like that. But because of my professional background before, I'm well used to writing, so I was able to develop the way that suited me best. And one of the things that I learned from a book by a novel, Dorothy L. Sayers, called Gaudy Night, that she wrote in the 1930s. A character is trying to write something and she can't for various reasons. And she says to herself, what do I want to say and why can't I say it? And once you're clear about that, what do you actually want to say? What do you want to happen in this scene? How does somebody react to what is happening. That's what you have to say to yourself. Put yourself in the character's position, you know, um, and then you can think, well, how would I have felt? Now, or do I know anybody where to whom something like that happened? And again, like, I've lived a long life, so I have a lot of experience in that as well. And yes, you do get tiny little echoes of things that I have personally experienced or my friends have or whatever, but I would never draw on somebody's experience to the extent that it is obvious or can be recognized, because I just feel you shouldn't do that. But there are things, and when I'm writing about children, I think back to when my own children were young. So, yeah, but it's a question of trying to put yourself into their thing. Say, well, if that were me, if somebody said that to me, how would I react? And you can have different possibilities. You can be completely cowed by an unkind word, or you can snap back. So then you have to say to yourself, well, what would my character do in this situation? And very often then, I say, like, it's nearly as if I'm listening to the dialogue, as if somebody is dictating it into my ear and I'm typing it out. The dialogue just comes then. But that's me.
Thank you for listening. Tune in to part 2 of my conversation with Catherine Kullmann next week.